So welcome to being almost done with Presbyterian Polity through Lancaster Theological Seminary. You've been an excellent class. I've been really proud of you for your engagement with this material, for the evidence of your growth in learning, and for the way that you really show that you have a depth and a breadth of understanding of Presbyterian polity that I think will serve you and the church well as you head into the future. You'll notice for this week that we're going to have an electronic class time together. We'll try that to see if we can have a class discussion and wrap one another up, talk about what we've learned, what questions still remain for you. There is not a requirement to do a post around what you've learned or engaged this week because I want to give you sufficient time to do the final examination and to do some reflection about what you have learned. I do want to offer some thoughts to you on just the way forward and some concluding remarks. You'll notice that there's a way forward commission from the General Assembly as we go through this. This title of this is not related to that. I started titling this presentation The Way Forward in 2008. It certainly has changed over the years, and they made that name just a year or two ago. No connection between the two, although obviously similar thoughts about how we move forward. I think there's two broad topics to talk about in terms of the way forward. First, I want to talk about our polity moving forward, but then I want to talk specifically about what it means to be a polity leader, and I think those are distinct, although they are obviously related. In terms of our polity moving forward, you will notice that Gray and Tucker do a great job at introducing the polity, but they are not asking the question, or really the questions that come from saying, is this system working in our present cultural context? And I want to talk with you about some ways that that question's been addressed, and then what it means in terms of our leadership. There's three of them that I'll address with you: the Peace, Unity, and Purity Task Force, which was commissioned in the early 2000s. A thought piece written by a sociologist, a Presbyterian sociologist, called Rebuilding the Presbyterian Establishment, and then just some reflections on our ongoing changes in terms of our polity, particularly the Book of Order. So the Peace, Unity, and Purity Task Force was created in 2001, and its goal was to lead the Presbyterian Church USA in spiritual discernment of our Christian identity in and for the 21st century. Broad topic, obviously supposed to be about peace, unity, and purity, a reflection on our ordination vows. And this particular report was came out of conversations about ordination and human sexuality, although that was not its primary focus. It did address that, but it not only addressed that. They engaged in Bible study. They met many times. They produced a 56-page final report, an 18-page Principles of Polity section that was received and enacted by the General Assembly. It's interesting to me to note that as they met, they often said something like, gosh, we want to find something different to do than a written report. But given the strictures of our polity, and this is the polity piece, that is what they ended up doing. They said that polity is one of our strengths, and they continue to say that about us as a denomination. They also came up with polity themes and points of balance and tension for us. They advanced the cause of communal discernment, and they offered what they thought was a way into peace, unity, and purity for the church. The reception, I'll just note two receptions of it. One is that in some ways this report, like a number of reports that I'll mention, lands with a thud. It doesn't actually make the difference that we hope it makes, and I think there's some polity implications for that. It's also the case that they were working on the thorny issue of ordination and human sexuality and trying to find a narrow way, a narrow polity way for us to broadly stay together, which I would just say just didn't work. The people who wanted openness found their proposal insufficient. The people who wanted to continue to maintain the Book of Order as it was then did not like what they saw as a way to go around with a clear meaning of the Book of Order. And so it was really a very challenging time. And basically, in terms of our polity, it just didn't work. Then Bo Weston wrote a thought piece, Rebuilding the Presbyterian Establishment. I gave a copy of that to you. If you want to read it, you're certainly not required to read it. He says the establishment, this is a sociologist saying an organization needs an establishment, which is an integrated body of authoritative leaders that have cultural commitments that draw them together and have structural positions that allow them to enact leadership and give them some power. They're not just the elite. He was trying not to say that, but that they're people who are committed to one another and the organization. They respect the authority of the organization and are committed to the future of the organization. And then he says, we undid our establishment in the 60s. We dispersed power and authority. We made mandates for inclusion. He makes the case that mandates for inclusion around gender and race, or particular ones that we have had, he says they're not useful anymore. And he says that theological diversity is a good cultural practice, but a bad structural principle. And that you actually want people who have a cohesive vision together leading. He would go back to vocational representation, meaning teaching elders and ruling elders, and having experienced, competent pastors at the linchpin of the system. He goes so far as to say that really in the 1960s and before, what we would call tall steeple pastors, pastors of larger Presbyterian churches who often were gifted and interested in administrative type thought, administration, who were good at it, were the linchpin of the system, but they were kind of pushed out as we undid the establishment. He recognizes that that was a good thing, but he thinks it's not serving us well anymore. He would have stated clerks and executive presbyters as advisors at General Assembly because they represent the structural memory and institutional commitments of the denomination, and he would have smaller presbyteries. And then he says that mistrust that Presbyterians now bestow on our leaders, especially at the national level, is among the chief reasons for the decline and dysfunction of our denominational structures. As you think about polity, there's a lot there. I offer this not so much that I agree with everything he says, but he says some things that are challenging to what is the intuition of many of us in terms of diversity, inclusion, because he's coming at it from a different direction, thinking about how do you get an organization to function well together. And I think it's good for us to always be listening to voices, even if they're voices that speak differently than we would in terms of the future. Again, I would say this landed with a thud, as you'll see as a theme. He is a Presbyterian. He's at a Presbyterian college. He's committed to the Presbyterian Church. I don't think he's widely viewed as someone who would be theologically kind of in one camp or another, but really as a person who's committed to the denomination. And I think that he's trying to do helpful work in terms of our polity structures that help us into the future. Finally, changes in the Book of Order. And I just want to note this for you. So we have a foundation section, completely new as of 2011. We have a form of government completely rewritten as of 2011. We have a directory for worship completely rewritten as of 2017. We have rules of discipline. Task force meeting presently may offer a complete rewrite in the next 4 or 5 years. In the span of a decade, we could have a completely different Book of Order. That is a lot of change. It raises the question of, is it the right change? There's been a lot of freedom, particularly with the form of government. And I think the question will remain for your generation of leaders and for me as my call continues, are these sections the right sections? Are they providing the right resources for us for this cultural moment? The form of government offered a lot more latitude. My own observation is that gets used some, but not a lot. We'll see what happens with the directory for worship. These texts, sometimes with new texts, when you change things, they get ignored because people don't understand them. So part of what I think you see here as upcoming teaching elders is you're going to have a lot of education to do because what people think they know may not be what they actually know. What that means is, there have been other attempts. There are many, many General Assembly reports. There's the church in the 21st century. There was a mid-council commission that asked for some latitude in terms of non-geographic presbyteries, but was told no about that. They were their report that said experiment was accepted, but none of the experiments that they proposed were actually accepted, and that is a challenge of an organization as it tries to move forward. Right now, we have a Way Forward Commission looking at the structure on a national level, and we've got a 2020 Vision team, both started by the same General Assembly. And part of what they've wondered is how do they work together? Basically, we are an anxious mess about the future with a lot of concern about do we remain as a denomination, and how do we remain as a denomination that was 4.5 million members in the combined northern and southern streams in the 1960s and are at about 1.8 million now. And when people talk, they talk about a 1.5 million member denomination. Lots of downsizing at the General Assembly, lots of pressure on presbyteries, lots of anxious congregations around their size and their ministry and mission. Which means this to me. You and I are called not just to be polity wonks or technical experts on polity, but to be leaders. Todd Bolsinger in the Canoeing the Mountains says leadership is energizing a community of people toward their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the face of a changing world. He acknowledges the changing world. He says that people have to do their own transformation and that the job of leadership is to help them do that. He recognizes on page 13 that often leadership in the church has been seen as teaching, liturgical leadership, and pastoral care. That what we do is we preach, we lead worship, we provide care. And think about that with the Book of Order. We've got sections in the Book of Order on liturgy. We've got sections on how we care for people. We've got sections on how we teach people. We call ourselves ministers of word, teaching, and sacrament. I think that he says that that's necessary but not sufficient. I think that what I would say to you as polity people is what you've learned in polity is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need to learn how to conduct a funeral service in a way that's meaningful and faithful. We need to know the polity. We need to be able to run meetings, but it's not enough these days. It's the basis. Without it, we are both flying blind and also not developing the trust that we need in terms of our own leadership, but it's not going to be enough. I'd commend page 112 to you on observation, interpretation, and intervention, his call for really looking closely, getting up on the balcony, seeing how the parts are moving together, asking lots and lots of questions, listening broadly so that we're not relying on our own interpretation, and then designing interventions that, and I'll go back to the previous slide, help a community of people toward their own transformation, not our transformation of them, but their own choices in transformation. He says that adaptive change stimulates resistance because it challenges people's habits, beliefs, and values. It asks them to lose. People are going to loss, disloyalty, and feeling incompetent. It's a lot to ask. No wonder people resist. And as we provide people with new books of order to learn, as they don't know what to do, as they lose cultural position, it's a lot. It will cause people to resist, which means we need to be technically competent. And you all and I need to know the Book of Order, know our polity well, but it is not sufficient. The future, I think, for us is technical competence. You and I need to know the polity. It is an adventurous heart, which means breathed in courage, relying on the Spirit, looking towards Jesus Christ to take us into his future for us. And it means people who can experiment, which is why I had you read Canoeing the Mountains and also Governance and Ministry, because Governance and Ministry points to some ways forward to think creatively about how we have structures that lead into ministry. They may or may not be the right ones. What Dan is doing there is trying to think about what will function faithfully and well now. Canoeing the Mountains, very similar. In other words, I think what the church needs is you. As you gain your technical competence, as you broaden your hearts in courage and adventure, and as you take risks, experiment, and help congregations learn God's future for them. God bless you. I look forward to being colleagues with you now and into the future.